The first thing the workers noticed was the smell, not rot, not decay, but something older, like soil that had never seen the sun. The old Willow Creek church had been abandoned for more than a century, its floorboards bent like ribs, its walls swallowing every whisper. The restoration crew expected termites, mold, maybe a few forgotten gravestones beneath the foundation. They did not expect a dining room. And certainly not one set for 7 people. The crew had been working since dawn, shaking dust out of their sleeves and cursing the old church's stubborn foundation when the excavator's bucket hit something that wasn't stone. The machine lurched, metal screeching against wood, and for a moment everyone thought they'd struck a forgotten coffin. But when the dust settled and the engine coughed to a halt, a strange quiet filled the hollowed space beneath the church floor. The men climbed down into the opening, boots sinking into soft earth that felt too loose, too recently disturbed for a building abandoned more than a century. One of the floodlights flickered as it swung on a cable, casting a trembling beam across something that should not have been there at all, a long wooden dining table sitting upright as if waiting for guests. It was impossibly intact, the varnish still visible beneath the film of soil, the legs perfectly aligned, the chairs tucked neatly around it. It made no sense. It could not make sense. Structures buried that long rot, collapse, or vanish entirely, they do not sit preserved like a time capsule sealed by intention. As the men brushed away more dirt, unease settled over them. There were 7 chairs, each facing the center of the table, each occupied. Skeletal figures sat slumped forward, heads bowed as if they had fallen asleep mid-prayer or mid-bite. Their bony hands rested near bowls that were still upright, not shattered or decayed, arranged with a precision that suggested someone had placed them carefully long after death. One worker muttered that they looked staged, like a macabre tableau someone had set and then entombed for reasons no one sane would imagine. The clothing on the remains, though tattered with age, still clung to the bones, faded wool, brittle linen, a child's frayed collar. Whatever had happened down here had happened deliberately, almost ceremoniously, as if the entire scene had been arranged for witnesses who would not arrive until a century too late. A heavy silence filled the pit as the crew absorbed the unnatural calm of the buried room. This wasn't a crypt, wasn't a grave, wasn't anything recorded in the church's limited archives. It was as if an entire dining scene had been swallowed and preserved by the earth itself. One of the younger workers whispered that the table looked like it had been waiting. Another swore the air felt warmer by the chairs, like breath still lingered there. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but they all sensed that this was not a space sealed by accident or time, it was a place intentionally hidden, and whatever story it belonged to had not ended when the soil covered it. The townspeople gathered quickly once news spread, their boots crunching over the frosted grass as they approached the church site with the same mixture of dread and morbid curiosity that had defined Willow Creek for generations. The sheriff, an older man whose family roots ran deeper than the church itself, was the first to climb down into the excavation pit. He froze the moment his flashlight landed on the table, his jaw tightening with a recognition that unsettled even the workers who had discovered the scene. When he stepped closer, brushing the dirt from the shoulder of one of the skeletal figures, he inhaled sharply. The cut of the wool coat, the small brass buttons, the stitched initials barely visible on the fabric were familiar to him from childhood stories he was told never to repeat outside the family. These weren't strangers. These were the Devlins. The identification ignited a wave of disbelief. The Devlin family had vanished in the bitter winter of 1892, leaving behind a boarded-up cabin, 3 unpaid mercantile bills, and the kind of silence that breeds folklore. The official record claimed they had simply packed up and left town searching for better prospects farther west. Willow Creek retold the story in hushed tones, never fully believing it but needing something to explain away the unease that came with their disappearance. No bodies were ever found, no belongings recovered, no traces of violence discovered around their home. It was as if the land itself had swallowed them. But now, staring down at the remains carefully seated around a buried table, the truth sharpened into something far more unsettling. Forensic teams were called in, and as they took samples and examined the remains, the confirmation became impossible to deny. Age markers aligned with the Devlin parents, the bone structure matched the older sons, and the smaller frame in the last chair belonged unmistakably to little Mary Devlin, who had been only 6 when the family vanished. The workers watched the professionals move around the scene with slow, deliberate care, their faces tight with the same question that everyone else was afraid to ask. If the Devlins were all here, arranged like participants in some arcane supper, why had the town been told they had left willingly? Why had nothing been disturbed above the ground? And if someone had buried them beneath the church, how had it been done without leaving any trace? The sheriff stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the tableau with a heaviness that pressed into his bones. The truth had shattered the town's comforting lie. The Devlins hadn't walked away from Willow Creek. They had never left at all. The forensic team spent the first few hours testing the bowls, plates, and utensils laid perfectly in front of each Devlin skeleton. Everyone expected old food remnants, perhaps traces of preserved grains or dried vegetables typical of the 1890s. But when the samples were collected and analyzed under portable field microscopes, confusion spread through the tent like a slow, creeping fog. There were no food particles at all. Instead, each bowl contained a mix of soil, fine ash, and a strange black fibrous material that didn't match any plant commonly found in the region. One specialist held a sample up to the light, watching the strands glisten with a faint oily sheen. He muttered that it resembled burned roots, but none he had ever seen before, and certainly not something meant for human consumption. The deeper they dug into the contents, the stranger things became. The soil itself was unnaturally rich, darker, and heavier than anything in the surrounding landscape. It held an almost metallic scent, as if enriched by something more than minerals and decay. The ash mixed within it puzzled the team further. It didn't match wood, vegetation, or any natural wildfire residue on record for the area. One technician suggested it might be from old manuscripts or parchment, but the other samples showed no signs of paper fibers. Whatever had been burned to create the ash didn't belong to anything easily identifiable. As they sifted through the blackened lily-like roots, they noticed something even more unsettling. Each bowl contained the same exact mixture, measured with uncanny precision, as though someone had carefully prepared the contents with a ritualistic purpose rather than for nourishment. The plates revealed even more disturbing signs. Instead of food scraps, faint circular indentations were etched into the surface, as if something had pressed into them repeatedly over time. These markings didn't resemble cutlery scratches or natural wear. They were symmetrical, deliberate, almost like symbols worn down by friction. The unusual dark residue nestled into these grooves made some of the team uncomfortable enough to step back, swearing it felt warm to the touch even though everything around them was cold. The utensils themselves were pristine, laid out perfectly parallel, untouched by rust or decay, as if they had been placed only days before despite being buried for more than a century. Rumors began circulating among the workers who watched from a distance, whispering that the Devlins hadn't gathered for dinner at all. They had gathered for something else, something older, something that required no bread, no meat, no vegetables, but instead demanded earth, ashes, and whatever those blackened roots once belonged to. The idea spread quietly at first, then more urgently, that this was not a meal meant to sustain the living but an offering meant to feed something beneath the soil. When the county archivists arrived to review the church's remaining artifacts, no one expected to find anything significant. The building had been stripped repeatedly over the decades, first by vandals, then by restoration attempts, and finally by neglect. But while inspecting the church organ, a hulking piece of warped wood and rusted pipes, one archivist noticed something out of place. Wedged behind the cracked pedalboard was a small leather-bound bundle, its edges curled from moisture and age. The moment he tugged it free, a thin cloud of dust drifted into the cold air, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and old ink. The bundle contained torn journal pages, their corners singed, their handwriting tight and frantic, belonging to Pastor Elijah Moore, the last known spiritual caretaker of Willow Creek before the church closed in 1893. The pastor's writing grew increasingly unstable the further the archivists read. The early entries seemed normal enough: sermons, weather notes, concerns about dwindling attendance. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. The pastor began describing strange nightly sounds beneath the church floor: soft tapping, rhythmic like knuckles brushing against hollow wood, and low vibrations that rattled the pews long after the congregation had gone home. He wrote of sleepless nights spent pacing the aisles with a lantern, convinced that something beneath the foundation was moving, breathing, crawling upward. But the most disturbing entries came in late December of 1892, just after the Devlin family was last seen. In shaky handwriting, Elijah Moore confessed that the Devlins had sought him out in desperation. They claimed the ground around their cabin had begun to shift at night, that small mounds of soil appeared in patterns around their property, and that they heard whispers rising from beneath the floorboards. The Devlins begged the pastor for help, not in the form of prayer but in knowledge. They believed something ancient and hungry lived beneath Willow Creek, something the elders of the region had once tried to appease through rituals long forgotten. Pastor Moore wrote that he resisted at first, insisting that such beliefs were superstition, relics of older, darker times. But as the disturbances grew worse, both in the church and around the Devlin home, he admitted he became afraid. The final legible entry was the most chilling. The pastor wrote that he had agreed to oversee a ritual meant to save the town from the hunger beneath the hills, though the details of the rite were written in fragmented, burned lines. He referenced an offering, a final meal, and instructions given to him by someone unnamed, someone he described as from the old families, the ones who remember what the soil demands. The writing cut off abruptly after he mentioned the Devlins gathering in the church at dusk. The remaining scraps of paper were charred black, the ink melted into unreadable streaks, leaving only the echo of his last coherent warning, that whatever lived beneath Willow Creek demanded obedience, and that failure to comply carried a cost no family should ever be asked to pay. The revelation of the missing eighth chair struck the investigative team harder than any forensic detail discovered so far. When the old census records were brought out, cross-checked against family archives and past testimonies, it became undeniable. The Devlins hadn't been a family of 7. They had been a family of 8. The youngest boy, Elias Devlin, barely 12, was recorded in school ledgers and church attendance notes, yet his name had slowly disappeared from the town's oral memory. Some of the elders still living, those who rarely spoke of the old days, shifted uncomfortably when asked about him. Their eyes drifted away, their voices thinning into strained whispers. Elias had always been different, they said, quiet, distant, with a habit of wandering alone into the woods behind the ridge where the soil grew strangely soft. Children had teased him for talking to the ground as if it were a living thing. Adults avoided him because he seemed to appear and vanish without sound, slipping through rooms like a shadow no one remembered letting in. As investigators studied the table again, the absence of the eighth chair no longer seemed like an oversight but a deliberate omission. The pastor's journal fragments hinted at it too, though only in small, unsettling phrases. He mentioned one Devlin child who was closest to the soil, and another line suggested the boy could open the earth like a door, words so cryptic and unnerving that they lingered long after the pages were returned to their evidence sleeves. Some theorized Elias might have been taken earlier, or buried elsewhere, or perhaps had escaped whatever ritual had been carried out that night. But the more the town elders were pressed for answers, the more their unwillingness to speak became suspiciously uniform. A few muttered that Elias wasn't like his siblings, that he had a sense for the below, an ability to sense shifts in the ground that no one else could feel. Rumors resurfaced old tales parents used to frighten their children into staying indoors after dusk. Stories of Elias standing motionless in the churchyard, head tilted, listening to something beneath the soil. Accounts of him leaving mud prints on the floor even on dry days. Someone recalled seeing him by the old well near the Devlin cabin on the last night the family was seen alive, speaking softly to what looked like empty air. As speculation grew heavier, one unspoken thought spread among the townspeople like a cold wind drifting room to room. If the Devlins had been offered to appease something beneath the ground, then where was the child who had always been closest to it? And more importantly, had Elias truly vanished with his family, or had he been left behind for a reason no one wanted to understand? The tremors began subtly, slipping into the quiet routines of Willow Creek like an unwelcome guest no one noticed at first. A coffee cup rattled on a kitchen counter. A picture frame shifted against a wall. Most residents blamed old plumbing, winter frost, or the worn-out soil that had long given the town its reputation for unstable foundations. But as the days passed after the Devlin excavation, the trembling grew more consistent, more rhythmic, almost as if it followed a pulse. At night, when the town sank into its cold, rural stillness, people woke to their beds quivering and the faint sensation that something beneath them was dragging its weight slowly through the earth. Dogs refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to whine at the doorframes or scratch anxiously at the backyards as though something unseen was moving just below the grass. By the end of the first week, the scraping sounds began. Homeowners reported hearing faint claw-like drags beneath their floorboards, a subtle but unmistakable friction that grew louder when someone walked across a room. One woman swore she heard knocking coming from inside the ground directly under her hallway, as if someone or something was tapping from the other side of the soil. Another claimed she saw small mounds of earth collected neatly by her front door at dawn, though the night before the ground had been perfectly smooth. People tried brushing off the occurrences with muttered excuses, but fear settled into the town like a fog that refused to lift. Every morning brought new reports of disturbed dirt, strange holes appearing overnight, and vines of blackened roots crawling up porch steps where no plants should have grown. The local power company was flooded with calls about flickering lights, though the technicians found nothing wrong with the wiring. Geologists who were brought in insisted there were no fault lines beneath the town capable of producing tremors this frequent or this localized. Yet the ground continued its nightly agitation, vibrating with a deep, unsettling energy. Residents near the church, the epicenter of the excavation, reported the strongest disturbances. Some claimed they heard whispers rising from the pit after sunset, voices carrying through the open air in a low, guttural hum that didn't resemble wind, insects, or any natural sound. A few even admitted to feeling the ground breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow rhythm that made their skin crawl. Fear turned to dread when the first security camera footage emerged. A shop owner reviewing his overnight recordings noticed a ripple move beneath the soil of his parking lot, shifting like a creature burrowing just beneath the surface. It was unmistakable, a long, slow undulation cutting through solid earth as effortlessly as someone gliding through water. The video spread quietly among the residents, confirming what everyone had begun to suspect but was too afraid to say aloud. Whatever had been buried with the Devlins had not stayed buried. And now, with the excavation disturbing the ground for the first time in over a century, something beneath Willow Creek had begun to wake. The appearance of Elias Devlin shattered the thin barrier between speculation and terror that had held Willow Creek together. It began one fog-heavy morning when the sheriff received 3 separate reports of a boy standing in the churchyard just before dawn, motionless, barefoot, and coated in soil that clung to him like a second skin. The callers insisted the child looked no older than 12, matching the archival drawings of Elias with uncanny precision. But what disturbed them most was not his resemblance to the missing Devlin boy, it was the way he stood, head angled slightly downward, as if he were listening to something deep beneath the ground. When the sheriff rushed to the site, the boy was gone, leaving behind only a perfect ring of disturbed soil, as though he had risen from the earth and returned to it just as quickly. As word spread, more sightings surfaced. A farmer claimed Elias appeared beside his barn at dusk, staring silently toward the tree line before dissolving into the shadows with impossible swiftness. A teenager swore she saw him walking along the creek bed, his footsteps sinking too deep, leaving impressions far heavier than a child's feet should make. Those who glimpsed him described his movements as unnervingly smooth, without the natural sway or bounce of a living body. They said he looked like he was gliding rather than walking, following some unseen path carved beneath the town. Reports of his eyes chilled the investigators the most. Some witnesses said they were pitch black, others claimed they were empty sockets, but all agreed they reflected light the way wet soil does, absorbing rather than shining. The sheriff, already shaken by the Devlin discovery, began to investigate the boy's reappearances with a sense of reluctant dread. He dug into old folklore, town legends, and the pastor's fragmented journal pages. Over and over, one detail surfaced: the Devlins had spoken of their youngest son having a strange connection to the land, an ability to sense the earth's movements, whispers, and moods. It was said Elias would wander outside at night and press his ear to the dirt as if it were speaking to him. Pastor Elijah Moore's final notes mentioned that the boy was the key, the one who understood what lay beneath the hills, the one who could open the soil like a door. That phrase now echoed in the sheriff's mind with a new, horrifying clarity. Residents began to fear the sightings were not glimpses of a lost child at all, but something born from the ritual that had claimed the Devlins more than a century ago. A few whispered that Elias was not alive, nor entirely dead, but something in between, a messenger or guardian for whatever dwelled under Willow Creek. Every report placed him near areas where the ground trembled the strongest, where soil shifted like restless breath. And with each new sighting, the tremors grew louder, more urgent, as if Elias appeared not to haunt the town, but to warn it that the thing beneath them was no longer sleeping. As the tremors intensified and Elias's eerie appearances grew more frequent, the investigators forced themselves to return to the excavation site one final time, hoping to uncover anything that could explain what was happening beneath Willow Creek. The pit had been partially filled for safety, but the soil kept sinking in unnatural patterns, as though something underground was pulling the earth downward. When they climbed back into the hollow beneath the church, the table and the 7 chairs were still preserved in the same chilling arrangement, but the air felt different. Warmer. Thicker. Almost humid, as if the ground itself was exhaling. The sheriff noticed immediately that the soil around the table legs had shifted, sliding outward in perfectly circular patterns, forming grooves that had not been there days earlier. At first, they thought it was erosion or collapse from the tremors, but then the patterns became clearer, symbols carved not by tools, but by movement pushing up from below. The investigators began removing the loose layers of dirt, brushing away fragments of earth to reveal what lay underneath. They expected more broken foundation stone or structural supports, but instead they discovered a shallow chamber of interlocking wooden beams, arranged in a hexagonal pattern unlike any known architectural method from the period. The beams had carvings etched deeply into them, spirals, branching lines, and shapes resembling twisted roots. As flashlights swept across the symbols, the sheriff felt something stir behind his ribs, an instinctive recognition he couldn't explain. These symbols matched the faint markings found on the plates recovered from the table, the same symmetrical designs whose purpose no one had been able to identify. One investigator reached down to clear soil from the deepest beam. The moment her glove brushed its surface, the ground beneath them pulsed. Not trembled, pulsed, like the slow thud of a heartbeat. Dust cascaded from the ceiling of the pit as the walls vibrated with a low, resonant groan. For a terrifying moment, the earth seemed to shift under their feet, rising and falling like an immense creature stretching after a long sleep. A fissure opened near the chamber's edge, releasing a warm gust of air that smelled of damp roots and something older, something metallic, almost like blood. The sheriff grabbed the investigator's arm and pulled her back just as more soil collapsed into the forming gap. Beneath the crumble of dirt, they heard something unmistakable, rhythmic, deliberate knocking, echoing up from the earth as if answering their intrusion. It became clear then that the Devlins had not simply been buried under the church. They had been placed at the threshold of something ancient and living, a gateway sealed by ritual and silence. And by disturbing the site, the investigators had done more than uncover the truth, they had opened the door the Devlins had died to keep closed.